Good day, good morning to everyone who have joined our session. My name is Georgetown University. I'm the Director of International Programs at European University at St. Petersburg, here in St. Petersburg, Russia. This is a lecture as part of our ENERPO programs workshop series where we invite scholars, guest lecturers, representatives of businesses, etc., people who are working in this or that format in the field of energy, very widely understood, energy politics as well. Our guest lecturer today, or guest speaker today is Dr. Adnan Vatansever. He's a senior lecturer at King's Russia Institute at King's College, London. Dr. Vatansever holds a PhD degree from Johns Hopkins University and an M.A. degree from Georgetown University. Among his other publications, his most recent publication, around which, as I understand today, our talk will be centered, is a book titled Oil in Putin's Russia that just was published, if I'm not mistaken, in this past spring. And I have not had the privilege of reading the actual book yet, but I'm hoping, to somehow fill that gap, at least partially, by today's event. So I'm not going to take too much more of everyone's time. Just one very minor housekeeping clarification to ask. I do see that actually, I think almost all of you have your camera switched off. Since this event is going to be recorded and then later posted on YouTube for its convenience of video-friendly usage, I would kindly ask you all to turn off your cameras. I will also do the same, and we'll let only Dr. Vatansever, I think, talk. And then at the end, in about 30 or 40 minutes of speech, please feel free to take as much as you need, Adnan. At the end, when we start the Q&A session, you can do both, either raise your hand in Zoom. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with that already, or pose your question in the chat, or just, go ahead and switch on your camera. That will already mean you have a question and you like to ask something. Okay, with this, I'm temporarily turning off my camera, and I'll share my screen just to have one or two slides uploaded here while we're listening to Dr. Vatansever. Here, Adnan, the floor is yours, the virtual floor.
Thank you very much, Georg. It's really a pleasure to be speaking at your university and to be interacting with your students again. It's my second time that I've had this opportunity, and it's always great to be present in your really great institution. Now, I'll go over perhaps over the main purposes of the research that I had. What are some of the big questions that I tried to raise, and what are some of the key answers that I found in this research? As a starting point, I'd like to start with three key facts that are quite often could appear quite striking. The first fact is that, the focus of the entire study is about oil. So it doesn't touch other key sectors in Russia, like gas, for example. So I have very much tried to understand any key questions that are related to oil and oil revenues in Russia. So the first fact is, during the Putin era, Russia has received more than $3 trillion of export revenues from oil alone. This is really a very massive figure, and it puts the oil sector as undoubtedly the most important source of wealth in Russia. So that's one of the starting points. The second key fact is that Russia appears to be in a fairly unique position with respect to this oil wealth. Unique positions in the sense that since 16th century Spain, you really don't see another major power in the world that has been so heavily reliant on mineral resources. The last one that used to be like that was Spain in the 16th century. And the third fact is that I'd like to draw attention is We know the current president, President Putin, has been at the helm of Russian politics for slightly over 2 decades now. And the last person in the past century, in the past 100 years, that presided at the helm in Kremlin and in politics in Russia or / USSR was actually Stalin. So it just raises the question, does that long tenure in one way or another, can it be explained to some extent with this oil wealth that Russia has? It is quite interesting that the other person who had a very long tenure was Leonid Brezhnev, and he happened to be presiding during a period of very substantial oil boom, actually, in global markets, and oil boom in the USSR as well. And then you had some other leaders who had shorter tenures, such as those that, Gorbachev would be one of them, President Yeltsin would be another one, who actually happened to preside during a period of low oil prices or contracting oil industry in Russia. So again, is there some kind of connection? Now, while this book actually provides some answers to that, whether Putin's tenure has benefited from this oil wealth, this is not actually the main goal of the book. The main goal of the book is actually more of a in-depth review of the oil rents and the different political battles that have happened with respect to oil rents. And the key puzzle in the book is about why in some areas the government's policies have endured over time, in fact, endured throughout the Putin era, whereas in some areas those policies have witnessed some very significant reversals over time, like shifting from one direction to another. Just as an example, Russia used to have used to be able to balance its budget at $20 a barrel about 15 years ago, when oil prices were about 50 or even double more than that. And then a few years later, during 2010 to 13, 14, even $100 a barrel, which was the case, was not sufficient to balance the budget, and Russia ended up running deficit. So what is happening there? Why exactly we see such a different approach in Russia in different areas, in different key, very critical policy areas? So in order to analyze all of these different political battles with respect to these colossal oil rents, which is, in terms of export revenues, is over 3 trillion during that period, I have established a model which I call rent allocation. It's about the entire process of rents that starts from the questions of who produces those rents, which are the companies that do that, to all the way to distributing the money that comes from oil revenues. So I have identified like three processes, in fact, 4 processes, but 3 phases in the rent allocation process. The first one is, as you can see, I'll just point it out, is the rent generation phase, which is basically about who is producing those rents, who is allowed to produce those rents. And in fact, equally important question is who should not be in the business of producing those rents. There are a lot of battles that have happened in the past 20 plus years on this question. The second one, the second part of this rent allocation process is about rent collection, which is a big political battle between the oil companies and the states about who should be getting what proportion of the rents. In reality, what happened during the Yeltsin era was the majority of those rents were ending up in the accounts of oil companies. Under Putin, this picture changed quite abruptly. The state has emerged as the dominant winner of those rents. It took several moves to accomplish that, several tax proposals and tax bills that had to be approved and so on. But the government has maintained that position and has been quite consistent in that respect. Then the other process that is important is about rent redistribution. And here I am talking about there are 2 agents of rent redistribution. One of them is the state, and the other one is the companies. The oil companies are also agents of rent redistribution. Let me just specify what exactly I mean. Now, the state after collecting those annually billions of dollars of revenues in the budget, or after collecting those revenues in the form of tax revenues and custom duties and so on from the oil companies, it actually has several policy tools to redistribute those rents. One of them is it could use it in the budget and spend it for various purposes. It can sponsor different tax cuts. For example, if you're collecting very high taxes from the oil sector, you can reduce some taxes on the population or particular sectors. And then there are two additional ways to engage in redistributive policies. One is to pay the foreign debt that the country has. Basically, it means taking the rents that the country has received and permanently take them away from your national economy. Basically pay foreign governments, foreign donors. And then the fourth way is to put aside those rents temporarily from your own national economy and put it into a so-called rainy day fund or an oil fund, as typically many oil-rich countries have done. So these are the four tools that Russia has had. And we'll see that in pretty much all of them, we see some kind of a diverse results there. In some areas, you see a lot of stability, a lot of consistent policies over time. In some others, a lot of reversals. Then the last element of this rent allocation structure that I'm examining is about rent redistribution conducted by oil companies themselves. Now, this is also another area of major political battles in Russia or in any country that actually has substantial amount of oil wealth or mineral wealth. So how exactly that rent redistribution happens? Well, oil companies, apart from paying taxes, they actually are involved in additional ways for sharing their wealth with different players. One of them is through foregone revenues. For example, they can subsidize the population by letting them get petroleum products at lower prices. In Russia, this does occur to some extent, although to much more limited extent compared to many oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, for example. Then another way is for oil companies to involve in oil trading and do that through an intermediary and give a big part of the profit to an intermediary, basically by selling the oil at much lower price than they could in international markets. So this is another way to share their wealth with some key players. And then other ways would be for extra to accept some extra costs. What are some of those extra costs? Those extra costs could be involved in the form of paying above the market amount or quite significant amount in transportation. They could be paying for social projects. They could be, bribes could be another way for that. Just an interesting example that fits here under this category is, for example, one oil company, Surgutneftegas, has been involved in construction of military nuclear submarine in the Far East. For example, this is definitely not a core expertise area or a business area for an oil company, and yet we see those kind of activities engaged by Russian companies, or they could be sponsoring different football teams, they could be building roads, they could be building hospitals, schools, and so on in different regions. This is, again, ways to share their wealth with a larger number of players. And quite often there is, this is something that happens all around the world among major corporations. In Russia's case, the main difference is that quite often those social contributions are not exactly on a voluntary basis. There's some different mechanism that is happening behind. And then finally, another mechanism is paying dividends. One example here, for example, would be, oil companies, several of these major oil companies do pay dividends, but you also have, for example, the owner of Rosneft, the largest oil company in Russia. The owner is Rosneftegas, state-owned Rosneftegas, which is actually supposed to be getting those dividends and put them in the national budget, in the federal budget. But if you track what has been happening in the past 10, 15 years, there have been years when that money has not got into the budget. Instead, it has gone into investments of shipyard in the Far East or power plants in different locations and so on. So this is, again, it just provides a possibility for at least from the from the perspective of policymakers, of the leadership in Russia, to actually to get the help of oil companies to turn them into something like what I would call an additional stabilization fund or an alternative to a budget. You can sponsor billions of dollars of work projects without really going through the budget, just outsourcing this job to be done by oil company, like in case of Rosneft, for example. Now, I'm not suggesting that there is anything right or anything wrong about that. I'm just suggesting that this creates different possibilities for sharing the wealth, and this is different possibilities for the flow of rents. So having examined just in briefly the entire picture about what I mean by rent allocation, it's just important to mention a few things, that all of these phases that we see, rent generation, rent collection, and rent redistribution by the state and by oil companies, all of them are happening simultaneously. And when you change one part of it in any part of this scheme, it might have impact on the rest of it. For example, if the government decides to expand its budgetary spending, it may need to cover the costs for that with more taxation on the oil companies. So there is some interrelationship. From the leadership perspective, the ideal scenario from a leadership perspective, not just in Russia but in any country that has this kind of rents, would be actually to have to maintain some degree of control over all of those aspects of rent allocation. And the extent to which it is successful can actually determine how long it stays in power. To a large extent, this is because how it manages, how a government, how a leadership manages rent allocation will determine how much public support it can secure over the long run, but also equally important, how much the support of the elites it can ensure in the longer run. So, and the final point, and I want to mention about this chart, is that transformative changes with respect to either of those two big players, the state or the oil companies, can have some quite massive repercussions on this entire picture about rent allocation. So this leads me to repeat the puzzle. What exactly is the puzzle? The puzzle is that in some of these areas we've seen a lot of continuity in terms of the government's approach in the past 20 years or so hasn't really changed, and I'll provide more examples. And in some areas we've seen a lot of policy reversals. And the key question is why exactly we see this kind of difference across all of these areas. In order to answer this question, I have resorted to a well-established theory that's known as the V2 players theory. And in the V2 players theory, in a general sense, in the shortest possible term, if I need to put that, is that it basically suggests that in a political context where you have very weak V2 players, as is the case in Russia, and V2 players in this case mean institutional V2 players, such as the Russian constitution sets basically four institutional V2 players. One is the executive branch, which is led by the president. The other one is the two branches of the legislature, and the fourth one is the regional governments. So we know that starting with the Putin era, the other V2 players were significantly weakened, and there was a very high degree of concentration of power. What the V2 player theory suggests in that case is that in a context like that, you can expect two things. You can expect that the state will be much more capable to launch a policy, to launch a new policy, basically to launch new big reforms and establish some new rules and so on. And this could relate to all of these aspects of rent allocation that I suggest here. And this is in technical terms, the V2 player theory uses the term decisiveness of the state. So the state can become quite decisive in a context of weak V2 players. But this comes at a significant cost. The cost is that the state is much less likely to be able to commit to its policies. And this is called resoluteness of the state, meaning that, yes, it might be fairly easy for the state to launch new policies, but sometimes those policies could be really good policies, and it may not be able to commit to those good policies. So a few years later, you see that the government has ended up in a very different direction. The big example, again, is Russia was during the first part of the 2000s was very widely praised by organizations such as World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and so on, about how prudently, how successfully it was managing its fiscal balances, and it was able to balance its budget very easily. It did not really even need the existing oil price. And then several years later, historic record of oil prices were no longer sufficient for Russia to balance its budget, and country was running budget deficits. So this is again quite an achievement at the beginning, and that achievement has been reversed over time. So just one example about what exactly has an area where we see a policy reversal. So what is my argument here is that what really explains this diversity in outcomes, that in some areas you have a lot more consistency, a lot more consistent policy and no policy reversals, whereas in some others you have a lot more policy reversals. One of the big reasons for that, in my view, is that according to veto players theory, yes, you can expect a very decisive state and no resolute state in contexts that are similar to Russia. But I suggest that the things are a lot more complicated if you go into further details that are also part of this veto player theory. Because one of the concepts in the veto player theory is that about how much consensus you have within the executive branch that makes decisions. The term that's used here is cohesion within the executive. And what I suggest here is that the extent of cohesion really matters about how long a policy can endure, or how long a policy has endured in Russia's case, the extent of cohesion within the executive branch. In areas where you had more cohesion from the very start, and that cohesion remained, you witnessed a lot more consistent policy over time. And in areas where there was no cohesion from the very start, you were more likely to see quite substantial policy reversals, basically a shift from one direction to another and back and forth again. But cohesion alone is, while it's a significant factor, I also suggest that there are additional key factors, such as what is the leadership's perception of political risks, what are the available resources to mitigate those risks, what is the time frame we're talking about? Is this a policy that you just need for a couple of years and then you don't need to return to that or not? And what is the scope of engagement of executive agencies? For example, in areas like taxation, you have very few agencies that are involved in that. It's basically the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Economic Development, and the Ministry of Energy, that the three primary players in that. Whereas in areas like budget, you have pretty much every executive agency that's involved, which makes cohesion a lot more difficult. So just to move on to the key results that I'd like to mention in this respect. In terms of what are some of the continuities and what are some of the key changes that we've seen, and how I explain with respect to each of those aspects of rent allocation. Starting with rent generation. The big continuity that we've seen from the beginning of Putin's era, in fact, from the 90s up to now, is basically on several grounds. One is foreign companies, foreign players have remained very limited in terms of their involvement in Russia's oil sector. This has not really changed. In fact, the expectations at the beginning of the 90s was that Russia would become like one of the huge magnets for foreign investments, and they would become quite major players there, as they did a few decades earlier in Middle East and somewhere else. This did not happen. They emerged as kind of always the minor partners in this. There are many reasons for that, but this is one of the continuity there. The other continuity is that in this rent generation process, which I call a rent generation model that Russia has, is the heavy reliance on vertically integrated companies. And just to avoid too much technicalities here, the general model in the world is that you can either have vertically integrated companies controlling most of the oil industry, or you can leave that task to be done by hundreds or dozens of independent oil companies, as is very much the case in the United States, for example. In Russia's case, the model has been based on vertically integrated companies. And the third one the third continuity has been the coexistence of private-owned and state-owned players. Despite many changes in ownership, these two types of players have continued to coexist in Russia throughout this era. What explains all of those continuities? Well, to a large extent, it has to do with executive cohesion, in the sense that you did not really have major disagreements within the Russian leadership, that some part of the leadership desiring to have much more significant involvement of foreign players in Russia, whereas others were opposed to that. In fact, there was kind of quite a consensus that foreign players had to stay fairly limited in terms of their involvement. And regarding some other aspects, such as the coexistence of private players and state players, and also the primacy of this model that's based on big vertically integrated companies. One of the reasons that this has been maintained is the proven benefits of this model. Russian oil sector has continued to grow with some minor exceptions. It has defied all of the expectations in the past 20 years, because if you look at different expert opinions, they would always suggest that Russian oil would peak in the next 2, 3, 5 years. It hasn't happened yet, and still the expectation is that it will peak in the next 2, 3, 5 years. But again, they may be proven wrong this time again. So it has proven the ability to actually to keep growing despite the different challenges that it has made. So apparently, the status quo that has been maintained is not detrimental to the growth in the sector. And finally, abandoning the existing model would probably bring some undesirable and unpredictable risks that the leadership wanted to avoid. For example, in a model that you have currently, you have very few players, which makes it a lot easier for the leadership to interact instead of having hundreds of players. And also, it allows the government to make some more drastic changes in terms of ownership in the current model, as it has happened in the past 20 years, in large part because you don't really have very significant foreign involvement. Like the sector is almost entirely controlled by Russia's own companies. On the other hand, the big area for change, big area of lack of stability, has been in terms of ownership. We've seen at the end of the 90s, the sector was almost entirely in the hands of the private sector. Rosneft was one of the smallest companies at that time, smallest vertically integrated companies. And eventually it emerged as the largest company over time. And also, eventually, it was also subject to some form of privatization as well itself. So there are many elements of instability in the model itself, in the sense of frequent changes in ownership. What exactly explains this? Well, to some extent, it could be explained by some of the underlying force there is the weak rule of law and the lack of commitment of the leadership to improve the rule of law, because in the context of weak rule of law, it's a lot easier to have changes in major changes in ownership. The other one is this instability of ownership has been also there has been some beneficial element of this instability for the leadership itself. It has allowed the leadership to rearrange the winners and losers over time, which is important for getting the support of key parts of the elite that matter for that leadership. So these are some of the explanations that I would provide on this. The first aspect of rent allocation, which is the rent generation model. On the second part, the rent collection. There has been, one can suggest here that there has been a huge continuity throughout the 20 plus years that we've seen Putin at the helm of Russian politics. The big continuity has been that the Russian government, once it managed to acquire the majority of the rents in the sector, it's actually continued to exercise this throughout the past 20 years. It achieved this possibility actually towards 2004 and 2005 after several changes in the tax rules, and it has really never backtracked from that. So despite all geological challenges or so on, still the state has not really backtracked from this key role of being the dominant earner, the dominant winner of Russia's oil rents. But this is, again, the big continuity. Well, what is really the explanation behind that? Again, I go back to my broader theoretical framework, which is to a large extent it is the executive cohesion you have. You basically did not really have significant players within the government that actually would like to challenge this primacy of the state in earning Russia's oil rents. You also a key factor is also here the weakened veto players. In the sense that, for example, during the 90s, the oil companies were able to approach regional governors or get some help from different parts of the Russian executive branch or the Duma to pass certain laws that would favor them. This was no longer the possibility pretty much in the past 20 years or after the first 2-3 years of Putin's tenure. This has no longer been the possibility. In terms of policy reversals, where exactly is the policy reversal in this area? Well, the policy reversal here is in terms of how frequently the tax laws have been changed in the past 20 years. They have been fluctuating quite a lot. There have been numerous attempts by the government to actually change the rules of taxation in the oil sector, all in the name of keeping high tax burden, which is the aspect of stability. But the instability is in the tax rules. And one can again explain this with the fact that the veto players were so weakened that the oil companies were no longer able to organize and to get their help to push for their own preferences for more stability in the rules. And within the context that Russia had with weak veto players, one key element here has been the rising role of the Ministry of Finance, which has been really the dominant player in deciding about tax rules for the sector, and its primacy has been filling the budget with revenues. And quite often you would see the Ministry of Finance agreeing to certain rules and a couple of years later deciding that these rules were too generous for the oil companies, so they need to be revised back, they need to be scaled back. So it has happened quite frequently. So you have some elements of stability, the stability being high tax burden maintained, and the element of instability being frequent changes in tax rules. Moving on to this rent redistribution by the state, this process of rent allocation that is quite significant. Here, really, the big continuity here has been with respect to paying Russia's foreign debt and maintaining very low foreign debt. And in fact, Russia paid that very early during Putin's first presidency, and Russia has maintained this primacy of low foreign debt since then. And in fact, currently Russia still appears as one of the world's least indebted countries. I mean, compare it to pretty much any random country in Europe, and Russia looks in a very excellent position in that respect. The other area of continuity has been the tax cuts that were given at the beginning of the 2000s. The so-called non-oil tax regime that was established at the beginning of 2000 has survived very well. There have been very, very minor changes since then in that respect. And again, to a large extent, it could be explained by the fact that there was a lot of executive cohesion in that matter about maintaining relatively lower tax burden on the non-oil economy at the expense of the oil sector. So these are some of the elements of continuity. But if we look at the other element, which is the budgetary spending and how the oil funds have been managed, there is indeed there are really a lot of examples of this lack of continuity or key policy reversals. The key example that I mentioned, the oil price that was needed to balance the budget really shifted over time quite significantly. Like in 2010 to 14, even $100 was not enough. But subsequently, like 2019, for example, if I remember correctly, the oil price that was sufficient to balance the budget was just 42. So Russia was once again able to shift to a different policy, which in technical terms would be defined as counter-cyclical fiscal policy, which allowed for this kind of a policy reversal. So you've seen also in terms of oil funds, if we look at the oil funds, it was the first few years they were managed in a very fiscally prudent way, and then eventually during the big oil boom that the world had between 2011 and 2014, Russia basically did not really put any significant amount back in the oil fund and instead preferred to spend it. The amount that was put in the oil funds was very limited, which underlined that there was kind of a shift towards a very expansionary fiscal policy. And then eventually we saw again a policy reversal where there is more primacy on putting money in the oil fund as well, and kind of a shift towards more a fiscally prudent approach. So what exactly explains this? Well, again, to a large extent, one can refer to these big changes to the lack of executive cohesion from the very start. There are many reasons about the lack of executive cohesion with respect to budgetary policies on oil funds, but to some extent they have to do with the setup of the with the setup of the Russian elite that is in power. You have had some fiscally conservative figures in the past, like Alexei Kudrin, but then you also have had some others like more of a Siloviki background that have had very different view about what should be the role of the state in the economy. And from the very start, you have this lack of cohesion that has been driving significant policy reversals over time. And within this context, what has really also amounted to this policy reversals has been Putin's own lack of commitment to a single camp. There is a prominent economist in Moscow, Evsei Gurbich, who basically defines Russia's battles over the budget as a battle of two camps. The first camp is the camp, basically the battle of two parties, he says. The first party is the party of saving, which has been traditionally led by fiscal conservatives like Kudrin, to some extent by the central bank as well, where you have only very few people that are in this camp, and all of the rest are actually in the so-called party of spending, where different ministries, different key personalities have come up with a huge number of proposals about how to spend this oil windfall that Russia has been receiving. And within that context, Putin's approach has been not to align himself with a single camp, but to maintain a flexible approach, to align with one camp at one point, and then to reverse, to change the direction over time, depending on some key factors such as perceptions of political risk. For example, the question of succession in 2008 was a really key reason about why you saw Russia moving away from a very fiscally conservative policies after 2005, basically launching national projects, increasing the amount of spending, and so on. So this was a big question mark. And then you can also see that from 2014, 2015 on, there is again return to fiscal prudence, in part because this question about re-election was no longer an urgency at that point. And there were also additional reasons, such as very high popularity in some way related to the Ukraine crisis as well, which actually allowed to some extent to return to fiscal prudence. So, and the final point that I'm covering here is the rent redistribution by the oil companies. What you can identify here is that the instabilities in terms of who has been the big winner and the big loser during that process. In oil trading, the big example is you had an oil company like Gunvor that appeared massively involved in becoming one of the world's largest oil traders, actually, thanks to really great deals with Russian oil companies. But eventually, its fate changed quite significantly. Its role in trading Russian oils changed over time. It's just one example about how winners and can be winners at some point, and their fortunes decline after time in terms of how they are being part of this flow of rents in Russia. But the big story here is actually a story of continuity, and the continuity is there is the continuity of informal rules, the primacy of informal rules in defining how exactly the oil companies are actually sharing their wealth with other players in the economy. And this has been something that has been there in the 90s, but has been also something that has continued throughout the Putin era, where again, the underlying element here is like weak rule of law, which allows for this to happen. But also, there are also multiple political benefits or functions that this weak rule of law allows, which is a continuous and periodic rearrangement of winners and losers. The leadership has that option to exercise that option in the case of weak rule of law, which would not be possible if you had strong rule of law. And it is quite significant for a leadership to maintain to support of part of the elites. Moving just very quickly to the last question. I know I've probably gone above my time limit, about the longevity, about the long tenure of Putin, and to what extent one can suggest that it has had to do with this big windfalls that Russia has received during the past 20 years. Again, if we look at each segment of rent allocation, we can say that in the rent generation model, the key thing has been there has been a lot of instability in terms of ownership, which has meant a lot of opportunities to rearrange winners and losers in the political system, in the economy, which has actually enhanced the resources that are available to the state leadership. And then there have been some elements of stability, which have also helped in many ways. They have to a larger extent, ensured that the Russian oil sector keeps growing and keeps overcoming many of the challenges that it's had, such as geological challenges. In terms of rent collection, here the main story has been about stability, and this stability has been the ability of the state to maintain very high tax burden on the oil sector, and this has allowed the leadership to maintain access to very sizable rents, and a lot of the redistributive policies actually hinge on this ability to maintain very high tax on this. And then in terms of the instability that you see in rent redistribution, there are indeed some periods of very fiscally prudent, fiscally conservative policies, which allowed the Russian leadership to build cushion to deal with future crises, as has been the case several times already. Russia has been, quote, much better prepared than many other countries in the world to international crisis, thanks to a big financial cushion. And then you've seen also some expansionary policies which have aimed to award the public or the elites, quite often coinciding with periods of concerns of increased concerns of re-election or succession, as was in the past. And then finally, the last aspect, rent redistribution by the states. What really the Russian leadership has achieved here through the primacy of informal rules is the ability to guide the process of rent falls from these companies. This is a major source of flexibility for a political leadership, and not necessarily in the context of Russia only, but in any other context where if informal rules do not have primacy, if it's instead the rule of law that has the primacy, it actually constrains the hands of a leadership in terms of how it interacts with key players such as oil companies or mineral resource developers, as would be the case in Norway, for example. In Russia's case, we see a different picture where the premise of informal rules has accorded the government as an additional source of flexibility. So that's where I'd like to stop, and I'll just welcome any comments, any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Adnan, for your very wonderful presentation of the topic. I think this was a very great introduction to the book, which oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you again for the presentation of the topic. And I'm sorry, I don't know how much of this was heard because my microphone was muted at some point. But a great and excellent presentation of your own research. Before going on to any questions or comments, I'd like to mention that I think we at some point we were also joined by Professor Nikita Lomagin, the academic director of the ENERPO program. So unless Professor Lomagin has any comments or questions at this moment, no, I don't see him now. Then we could perhaps go on and turn to the question and answer part. So dear audience, as I said in the very beginning, if you have any question, put it in the chat or raise your hand or let me know if you're willing just to turn your camera on and ask your own question. So far I see one from Miriam. What do you think, that Miriam Kuba is asking, what do you think will be the key issues in the future? Miriam, if you can hear us, perhaps you could provide more detail. Key issues in what sense?
Like, for example, also in terms of the ongoing relationship with the EU.
Okay.
Maybe it's a bit general, but I'm not from Russia, and I'm wondering how this whole topic will develop in the future, if that's understandable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's yes, it's a fair question. It's broad, but it just maybe if I could answer it in broader terms as well. So if you looked at the charts that I was showing the past half an hour or so, at the center of this is actually the flow of revenues, of oil revenues. It is the main source of wealth for Russia, and is likely to remain significant source, maybe the main source for quite some time as well. Now, the big question here is that how prepared Russia will be to a post-petroleum future. Now, currently, Russia has established quite solid institutional setting to deal actually with problems such as fluctuation in oil prices, and many countries actually don't have those kind of institutional setting. Many countries are simply not capable to deal with fluctuation in oil price, and they do fluctuate quite significantly over time, and they end up with severe financial crisis and so on. So in that respect, Russia appears to be much better prepared to deal with one of the key problems that is brought by this dependence on oil revenues. But what Russia is not prepared to deal with is a post-petroleum future, because the economy still appears to be heavily reliant on oil revenues, to much lesser extent gas revenues, as oil is really the dominant source of revenue for the state. And it does raise big questions. What happens if some of the predictions about peaking demand for oil in the world are coming true sooner than later? I mean, the estimates are different, but according to some estimates, this might happen by the end of this decade, which is actually quite soon, much sooner than many in Russia would like to see, because the economy is not prepared to deal with this huge loss of revenues that would be accompanied with that. Now, in terms of relations with Europe, just to put it in the same logical sequence there, in Europe is taking the question about climate. I mean, it's one part of the world that actually takes the climate mitigation and climate problems much more seriously than many others. And the big source of conflict that might be arising in the near future is Europe's intention to establish carbon border tax about importing goods from other countries. And this is something that has already triggered a lot of interest within the Russian establishment about EU carbon, border carbon tax, because it is, it's unclear how exactly it will affect Russia, but it is very likely that it will have quite major repercussions on Russia. And as a result, the next few years or so might be years of quite intense negotiations and some disagreements between Europe, between the European Union, European Commission, and so on, and Russia. And at the core of all of this stands actually Russia's mineral resource wealth. It is a country that, heavily relies on oil and gas exports, and these are not exactly considered climate-friendly commodities. And again, this would be, I believe, would be one major area of a complication in its relations with.
Thank you, Adnan, for the answer. Actually, as perhaps a continuation to this, to what you mentioned, including this more the carbon taxes and the ongoing transition in the sphere of energy. If I understood you correctly, you said that in a way one could approach this flexibility of informal rule, not to call it absence of rule of law, but just the informal tradition of rules, as a possible advantage of the Russian system, if that's what I understood. Could that be? Do you think could that be a hindering effect, or in fact the opposite, an advantage when Russia needs to quickly respond to the ongoing transformation and the transition in the energy sector, for example, including these talks with the EU, or in other words, if there was more freedom of oil companies, etc., would they be more quick to react to the global change?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great question and at the same time a very difficult question. Regarding could that be an advantage? Well, Russia's advantage would be could be in the sense that the decisive the term here is the decisiveness of the state. The state it can be very decisive. It can actually launch new policy shifts very quickly, much more quickly than many other countries can do. In large part because of this very high degree of concentration of power, the ability of the executive to pass laws through the legislature much more easily than you would see in Britain or in many other parts. So this is a significant advantage. Now, in terms of the constraints, though, there is I mean, the major constraint would be a structural one. If you have a government that quite significantly depends on oil revenues, and there is no alternative to that, no easy alternative to that in the near term. In the longer term, there are obviously many alternatives. In the near term, it actually constrains the ability of the government to take some action, to take some action that would push the country in a very different direction. On the other hand, again, I'm just thinking loud here, but if you would leave the response to oil companies to issues such as border tax, I think oil companies will be operating under very, very different incentives compared to a government. The government needs to think about issues such as economic diversification, about inequality, poverty, long term, and a lot of different issues. Among all of these issues, one of the critical issues is obviously the high dependence on revenues that come from the oil sector. But it has to think about all of this in a very balanced way, and there are very different interests that are balancing to some extent each other, which allows perhaps the state to be kind of a much better informed actor and more interested actor to do something about long-term trends that might affect the country, such as border tax or transition to a new energy. In the oil sector, I just don't see that they are not operating under the same incentives. For them, the key incentive would be, to continue as long as possible with the current model. I mean, they yes, to some extent, they do have the incentive to have lower taxation, and lower taxation could become possible if you have a more of a diversified economy. That's true. But then it becomes kind of a trade-off between their near-term interests versus long-term interests, because this lower taxation cannot be accomplished in the short term. Their short-term interests would be very much based on the status quo.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. We have another question from the audience. Well, first, they're thanking you for a very well-balanced lecture. That's from Mim Hassin Chatni, an enlightening lecture. The question goes, I'm pondering on one dilemma that is the key reason for the budget deficit over the years is lack of privatization or lack of strong continuous policies by the Russian government.
Well, the key reason for budget deficits, I mean, Russia's budget deficit has been very cyclical. It had periods of like the 2000s, for example, all until the Great Recession had started having impact on the global economy. Russia ran actually surpluses consistently, and this is again was regarded as quite a praiseworthy approach by the Russian government. It was considered, in technical terms, it was the very good enforcement of counter-cyclical approach. But then you did not really see that for some time, like even during the second oil boom that we witnessed in the past 20 years, between 2010 and 14, especially 11 and 14. You did not see this. And in fact, Russia eventually ended up with budget deficit in the middle of an oil boom. Now, what exactly contributes to such kind of approach? Well, it has many elements that one can provide there. I mean, it's very much driven by expansionary expenditure policy. And what drives expansionary expenditure policy? Well, if you look at 2000, starting actually from 2006-7, you see the first signs, especially, but still surpluses. But the deficits are coming much later. I mean, a big part of that is concerns about public support by the Russian president and concerns about re-election or concerns about succession. These are things that are actually key political factors that are probably more likely to explain why you end up with periods of budget deficits than lack of privatization revenues. That would probably, maybe it's a factor, but it wouldn't be that much of a significant factor. And then also, you also have obviously some periods of unusual politics, which is 2008-9 crisis and now the COVID crisis, where having a deficit is just not exactly something unexpected. I mean, many countries in the world have deficit. In fact, Russia during the current crisis is having much smaller deficit compared to many countries around the world, especially compared to G20 economies. So it's not doing worse than many other countries, I would say. But again, the big picture in the past 20 years is that it's really political leadership's perceptions about what are the political risks with respect to re-election, with respect to overall public support, or with respect to succession, if that problem exists. Now, currently, at least in the current context, yes, there are approaching elections that are Duma-related elections, but presidential elections are still far away. The question of succession is not yet on the agenda, which actually lowers the risk, which I think provides kind of a possibility for Russia to once again to shift back to at least it has already shifted back, but to maintain a policy of counter-cyclical fiscal approach, which means managing to have budgetary surplus, collect more and more revenues into its oil fund, national wealth fund, and then use those revenues during rainy days when oil prices collapse and run through that. And in fact, the reserves are still quite substantial, which actually do allow Russia to have quite a significant fiscal scope during the next few years at least.
Yeah. Thank you. Dear colleagues, do you have any other questions or comments so far? I don't see any in the chat. Okay, 2 hands raised. Just a second. I'm trying to figure. So Danny, Tero, and Nikita. Danny, please go ahead. Turn your camera on. Yeah, okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for hosting. So my question deals with the current instability of the model, as you were pointing out in your lecture of renter economy, especially dealing with commodities. So within the flexibility, or as you were saying, the informal rule flexibility of the Russian system, would you see, or did you see in the research, taking the confines of where we are today and the fact that for the foreseeable future, there might not be change, do you see avenues to stabilize the instability inherent in the current system, if that makes sense?
Yeah, the instability is, if you look at the model, it actually has basically 4 big components in the model, and in each of the components there are some elements of stability and some elements of instability. I guess the answer will need to depend will need to be related to each of those elements, because the model is not what I'm not suggesting that there's instability in the political system or anything. It's more about the term stability or instability is about the approach of the government to a particular aspect of rent allocation. In some aspects of rent allocation, you've had a lot of stability, basically continuity, and in some aspects of rent allocation, you've had a lot of instability, which is policy reversals, in other words. So, where would I see the scope in the future? In terms of again, if we would pick certain elements such as ownership, for example, the key instability has been in terms of ownership in the oil sector, because you've had some big players like Yukos, the largest oil company, gone, taken over by one of the smallest companies. Now the smallest company has become the largest, but it also has been subject to privatization. There is this element of instability. In areas like that, I would suggest that this instability is a source of strength for the political leadership, and it is likely to continue for the main reason that this instability is actually bringing a lot of political dividends. if you did not have this kind of instability, if you had a very rigid approach to ownership, for example, if Russia's oil companies were still the same companies from 20 years ago, nothing had changed or so on, and in fact, you had no ability to change that, it is actually, you can consider this as a kind of a significant constraint in the hands of a political leadership about what to do about the oil sector, how to direct the rents in the oil sector, and has a lot of broader repercussions. Whereas when you have a leadership that can actually rearrange the decks, rearrange the winners, the losers in the sector, it's actually a major source of flexibility for the leadership. And as a result, this instability is a source of strength for the state. And it is also interesting, it is actually proven that it can work in the sense that the oil sector has not really gone bust. It has kept growing, with exception for very few years in the past 20 years. It has actually had positive growth. And despite all of these expectations that this would not happen. The same thing about the instability with respect to who is winning in case of oil companies redistributing their own rents. There might be now one trading company as a winner this year, 5 years later might be another one. Again, it's very much, again, a source of flexibility, this kind of ability to rearrange the winners and losers over time. And as a result, I do think that this will remain kind of something that, you are likely to see more instability in the future in that sense. Some elements of stability would be like the high tax burden on the oil sector, for example. I don't see the states will relinquish its success in that area because so many things depend on that success. And it has been trying to calibrate its tax rules constantly and in order to maintain this one big objective. So its approach in that area has been very consistent and is likely to remain consistent because many things depend on that. The stakes are very high, but it's also because there is very much of an executive cohesion in that area. You wouldn't really find different key ministries that would like to see a return to the 90s. Basically, let the oil companies capture as much rent as possible. Let them, the state should remove its involvement from this big source of revenues and let them thrive even better. There is no such a thing. You wouldn't really find that kind of approach there. And finally, regarding instability about the fiscal approach, this instability is again, if it's very much it's cyclical to some extent. It has to do with political cycles in Russia, whether there are concerns about elections or succession and so on. So to me, it suggests that in the future you will also have shifts from fiscally prudent policy to kind of a more spending-based policy in the future when the leadership perceives that political risks are going high, when the popularity of the president goes down, and so on. So this, I think, the past 20 years, if they're teaching us one thing, is that in the next 10 years, probably we'll also see periods of shifts of very highly fiscally prudent policy that you see to some extent in the past few years again, and then shift towards kind of a more of an expansionary policy where suddenly the oil price that you see in the global market is no longer sufficient for the Russian budget. And more likely this will be a period when these big concerns about re-election, about public support have become more pronounced than they are currently, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Nikita Triandafilidis also had a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you for the lecture first. Very interesting and hour over here. So my question is about oil market flexibility. So we talked about the EU before, and what came to my mind is that if by any case there's this continuation of let's say political turmoil, the sanctions that we hear, the controversies and everything like that, there's a possibility of the Russian market trying to diversify away from the European market, which might not happen exactly, but there's speculation about that. In the case of the EU, they can do that. They can diversify their market towards Norway, towards Qatar, Saudi Arabia, whichever part of the world you think. However, is that possible also in the current situation with the Putin government? Can they so easily be flexible with their market and move, let's say, away from the European market when it comes to oil exports? I mean, some analysts say, let's say, okay, that China is a big market, we should always look over there. But my question is this: if China is not reliable, by your opinion, which part of the world or which countries will be more friendly openly to imports of Russian oil if anything happens with the European Union and they cannot find a vital solution into like a continuation of their like export import situation?
Yeah, well, it's quite a complex question with respect to EU sanctions targeting among Russia's energy sectors. The main target has been actually the oil sector. Now, in terms of what happens if EU countries start, I mean, if they want to move away from Russian oil, I mean, in my opinion, nothing happens actually. Oil is a global commodity. Unlike gas, there is no such a thing as losing market in case of oil. You would find from the non-expert community in Europe maybe claiming that let's reduce reliance on Russian oil and so on. I mean, the immediate impact would be if they get more oil, let's say from United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia. The oil that Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates were sending elsewhere, that will leave a gap that it will be sent to Europe, and that gap needs to be filled by somebody. Most likely that will be Russia. So it will require some rearrangement. For example, Russia may be shipping more and more oil to more further destinations around the world rather than shipping it to its closest proximity, which is Europe. But if you would calculate how much this would matter financially, the cost of shipping oil is actually a very small part of the calculation for an oil company. I mean, from a port, not from from West Siberia, bringing it all the way to the Baltics. It's one cost which could be significant. But once it reaches a tanker, whether that tanker goes to Shanghai or goes to Rotterdam, it really per barrels that you would calculate, it would not really make that much of a big difference. And the other thing is that if you send it to more distant markets like the Asian markets, there is also slight price differential that they pay a little bit higher than in the European markets, which would be outweighing some of the extra transportation costs. But my general point is that there is, I find any discussions about Europe moving away from dependence on Russian oil kind of very based on very weak foundations. Now, the discussion on Russia moving away from Russian gas is a separate story because gas is not the same kind of commodity. It actually does build mutual dependencies, unlike in case of oil. Oil is a global commodity. I mean, if you are not getting it from one source, you can get it from another, but also the seller can sell it elsewhere very, very easily at no significant cost. And the last point about that would be, in Europe, you don't really, I mean, you have really dozens, maybe even hundreds of players that are involved in the business of importing oil from Russia or from other countries. And it does make for many of them economic sense to get it from Russia. In fact, the Druzhba pipeline, for example, has been operating pretty well for decades, and it has a reason because it is basically connected with some really quite significant refineries in Europe. It just brings the oil directly from Russia. There is some economic logic from European perspective as well to maintain oil imports from Russia, and if it decides to get it from elsewhere, it would really need to have some very restrictive regulations that will be forbidding that purchase from Russia. I don't know how far they can go with those kind of regulations, but the main point that would constrain any regulation like that would be that even if they did that, it won't matter. Russia oil will end up in the global markets. I mean, it's not like gas. It will end up. The moment you produce oil will find its market. That's the reality. It may require some delay of a couple months, maybe, to rearrange contracts and so on, but it's not really a futile for an oil company.
Thank you. Thanks for your question, Nikita, and for the answer. Yeah, indeed, the difference between oil and gas. I did have a question actually about the perhaps a comparative approach to the natural gas sector here in Russia, would how much would what you have studied about the oil sector inside Russia, the domestic revenue generation and redistribution, how much are they similar with what the revenues with what is happening with the revenues from natural gas sales of Russia inside the country? So,
it's a excellent point to actually to examine in a comparative sense. Maybe that might be something that I do in the future. Actually, now there are a lot of similarities. Like if you would, for example, replace in the chart the rent redistribution conducted by oil companies, you can put there Gazprom, and you can see pretty much all of the similar activities, such as Gazprom involved in financing social projects, or Gazprom incurring excessive costs for the hiring companies that are charging excessively high for pipelines or things like that. It's all been in the news, all based on open resources. So it is involved in a very similar way of sharing its wealth with a large number of players in Russia, as oil companies are doing, apart from paying taxes. Now, the big difference for the gas sector has been that it has been taxed significantly less than the oil sector. It's actually a sector that bears very low tax burden, and compared to the oil sector. And this has been the result of a kind of a mutual understanding between the government and Gazprom's management that gas is actually a highly subsidized commodity in Russia still. Gas is also much more significant commodity, an energy commodity for in the energy balance of Russia than oil. Almost about half of Russian energy use is actually gas. So, and as a result, there has been kind of understanding that because of Gazprom's continuous role in selling gas at kind of prices that are significantly below European prices, what is called as Netback parity, is kind of has been a reason for charging Gazprom lower taxes than in the oil sector. In the oil sector, yes, oil prices have been also somewhat lower than international oil prices, but the differential has not been as big as in the case of natural gas. So that would be one big difference. The other one, in terms of the rent generation model, I think that's one area where one can see significant differences between the oil and gas, because in the oil sector, the 90s was sector of privatization of the sector. Then there was a nationalization process. Then there has been partial privatization and the coexistence of several really large vertically integrated oil companies. In the gas sector, that kind of privatization did not happen in the 90s. It hasn't actually ever happened in the same sense. You basically have had oil companies and also one big independent gas company, Novatek, emerging more and more significant over time. So the trend in the gas sector has been the timing of the key trends has been different. But you also see the gas sector now headed towards kind of a coexistence of more and more players, even though Gazprom is still the overwhelming, the biggest player in the sector, and also a player that also has, unlike in the oil sector, actually controls the transportation segment of the value chain. In the oil sector, you don't have oil companies don't control that. There is a Transneft, a separate company that controls that, I think the organizational setup still remains significantly different, although there are some similarities in terms of the rising coexistence of a diverse set of companies, both in the gas sector and in the oil sector.
Thank you. And my other question is slightly maybe a continuation of the previous one, and I don't know how much this is within the scope of your own interest, of course, but since you mentioned the differences between natural gas and oil and government's different approaches, with regards to taxing, etc. What I just thought about right now is that there is this common knowledge of really low prices for natural gas domestically here, right? For households at least, as a part of perhaps this social contract or something. I mean, if one ever thought of liberalizing the domestic natural gas market, perhaps that could, cause at least social protest, if not, much more problems for the government. But on the other hand, in the oil sector, I don't really see that much of the same, commitment to making the prices go so low. And we know of, at least a few countries where the share of the state is huge in the energy sector, and it's particularly in the oil companies, where they do provide subsidies to make, petroleum for cars as cheap as possible. Do you have any insight on that, on why, natural gas, yes, gets the support of the state, and petroleum is relatively liberalized? And, people complain here about how expensive it is to fill your car tank.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to some key choices that were made in the 90s. One of the key choices was in the middle of the 90s, prices for oil were actually liberalized. And the guiding principle for price formation in Russia since then in the oil sector for petroleum products has been so-called Netback export parity, which is basically, in theory, Russia's domestic oil prices should be equal to the international oil prices minus the transportation costs, which are quite significant in Russia still, and minus the export duty that is charged for exporting any amount of crude oil or petroleum products. Now, considering that in the past decades and earlier, those export duties were actually very high. The government's approach has been actually to lower and lower those export duties in recent years and to phase them out in the next 4 years. But if you consider that at some point they were reaching like 40% or so of the prices, it would automatically mean that domestic prices were about 40% plus the transportation costs. Create a significant differential between international prices and domestic prices, and still you would claim that your prices are equivalent to international prices minus these differentials created by artificial policies and transportation. So the government's approach on that more recently has been to phase out those export duties to replace them with different kind of a tax regime for the oil sector. And in its place, it has been basically negotiating with oil companies to try to cap the prices in the oil. In retail oil sales. So it's been a different approach. So there has been actually a policy that has tried to maintain relatively lower prices than international oil prices, but it has not really achieved the same result as in case of gas, in part because the way that oil sector functions. It is pretty much any oil that is not consumed in Russia, that there is no demand for it, will end up in foreign markets. It will find its way to end up in foreign markets because oil can be transported so easily. It can be transported by trucks, railways, tankers, river tankers, and so on. In case of gas, it's just the nature of the commodity. It is actually a sector where the government has actually, the prices were never liberalized in the 90s, unlike in the oil sector. And also it's a sector where it's much more prone to having a natural monopoly where, it has to be transported through Gazprom's transportation network, or in more recent years through LNG as well, liquefied natural gas tankers. But this is kind of a still very small portion of the entire value chain. In a context like that, what has happened is that your international prices and domestic prices are not exactly connected. So your domestic prices are very much of a product of government regulation about, the Federal Anti-Monopoly Agency fast basically setting certain rules about how high they can go and so on, and also setting some rules for residential users, some rules for non-residential users. And the key thing here to mention is that if, for example, if in the oil sector has been producing as much as it can, except during this period of agreements with OPEC, temporary agreements to cut production, it has been producing as much as it can because it finds buyers both at home and abroad very easily. In case of the gas sector, the production has been determined by the amount of demand only. It has not been by the amount of the ability of the gas sector to produce. Like 2-3 years earlier, Gazprom was claiming that it could produce an extra of 150 billion cubic meters, almost the amount that it was exporting to Europe, in excess to what it was producing, but it was not producing that simply because there was no market for that. It basically still, the reason I'm saying is that is that it just the two commodities, because they operate so differently, they have required a different pricing approach by the government. And also one reason why the gas sector has been more subsidized is precisely because gas is about half of Russia's energy balance, whereas oil is not. I mean, gas is much more significant commodity, and I mean, significant not just directly when consumers pay their gas bill. That gas bill can be quite small actually in international comparisons, but it's also it's an intermediary commodity. A lot of Russia's power plants actually use natural gas, so your electricity price to some extent is a product of subsidized, I mean, or at least lower priced natural gas because of various natural constraints that are because lack of sufficient external markets, which allows you to supply at home as much as you can, but there is no infinite demand for that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate your answer. We have one more question from the audience, and before I read that out, I want to call upon everyone, if you have, because we have only a few minutes left, that we don't want to take too much of Dr. Vatansever's time. So please prepare your last question, perhaps, if you have one. And with that in mind, I will read out the question. So it is, when you spoke about instability in the tax rules and spoke about high tax burden, did you refer to tax cuts? Also, if I'm not wrong, the instability of the theory refers to a market failure in the energy sector to some extent, as the market lacks perfect competition and also economic openness.
Okay, I guess it has two parts. Let me try to answer the first part at least. The instability, yes, I do refer to tax cuts. The approach since 2006 for Russia has been actually to give tax exemptions. Basically, some of them referred as tax holidays. And it started as a very simple process of giving very limited number of tax exemptions to companies in select fields, such as East Siberia, more in the Arctic, and so on. But eventually, they proliferated to such an extent that it became extremely difficult for the government to manage from administrative perspective. And the difficulty has been in the sense of deciding whether the given tax break, tax cut is actually sufficient for the oil companies to maintain production, to keep growing, or is it too generous? So that's why you've seen a lot of times the Ministry of Finance stepping in and saying that these tax cuts turn out to be too generous, so we are taking them back, or at least we are revising the terms. And this is the instability. So, but correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm answering the wrong question here, because I understood the question was about the oil sector, because there are tax cuts in the non-oil sector as well, which is a separate story. Is this what you had in mind, or is it was it about the oil sector specifically?
Yeah, that question was from Meme Hassan Chadni. If you can add anything, because unfortunately I cannot clarify the question myself. Yeah.
Okay.
It was about the oil sector, she writes.
Yeah. It was about the oil sector. Okay, all right. So if it's about the oil sector, that's so that would be my answer. The simple fact that having many tax exemptions creates an administrative burden is also kind of a very likely cause to have instability, because I mean, if I need to go a bit more into technicalities, now the ways that many tax administrations are established in places like Norway or in other countries with strong institutions is that for the tax burden to be administratively given not only to the Ministry of Finance, but also to benefit from the expertise of other ministries, such as Ministry of Mineral Resources, Ministry of Energy, and so on, which actually have geologists that are employed in their ministries. So those geologists actually have better sense about what is a good tax burden, what is like too high tax versus too low tax. In case of Ministry of Finance, you have this lack of expertise, and it becomes quite administratively difficult to decide when exactly the tax burden is sufficiently higher or sufficiently low. And because of that, you end up with significant policy reversals over time, simply because the government sees that this year the companies made quite a lot of profit, much more than they were expecting. So maybe the tax is too high, too low. They reverse it next few years. They see that they might be struggling, so they reverse it again. So this is one of the natural outcomes of that. But at the core of the problem, at the core of the entire problem is actually the design of the tax regime itself, which is in many settings, again, in some countries, the focus of the tax is actually to target profits in the sector. In Russia, what Putin established at the beginning of his term was a tax system that was targeting not profits, but gross revenues. It was actually a perfect system in terms of collecting taxes because it left almost no opportunities to cheat. So it was very effective, but it actually widely disregarded different costs across companies. Like every company may operate different costs. In fact, every company has different fields that can operate at different costs. And this tax system did not really make distinction between them. And that's why it led to some remedies by giving tax holidays. And those tax holidays were very difficult to administer. That's why there have been attempts to reverse them and so on. But the new trend in Russia has been to gradually try to shift towards pilot projects that will be targeting profits rather than gross revenues. So if Russia manages to do that, it will require quite significant new administrative capacity to do so. But once it manages to do that, one can expect more of a system that has fewer changes in tax rules than you've seen in the past 20 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, dear audience, if you, again, this is a chance for a last question. If you have, if you do, please feel free to write it down or think about it. But otherwise, I will be, before thanking and saying goodbye to everyone, I'd like to mention once again that Dr. Adnan Vatansever joining us today is coming from King's Russia Institute, King's College London, an institution that we have very warm relationships with, from time to time at least. I'd like to actually use this chance to thank you. For a few years ago, the King's College London and King's Russia Institute particularly have helped us actually saving the lives of our students, which needed to continue their degrees and to receive their degrees due to problems here at the European University, and they had to continue their studies. But besides that, one thing is that we always like to mention, when I talk to people and I tell about the ENERPO program, I like to mention that this program is very unique. And then I think I say if there's any other example I could think of is the program which is not based in Russia, but it's in London. So if you're looking for studies in London, then check out King's Russia Institute. So I do want to mention the postgraduate courses at King's Russia Institute on Russian and Eurasian economics and politics for everyone who may be interested and who hasn't had the happy chance of studying at the USP yet, or maybe take a second degree. Why not? And besides that, I also want to mention once again that today we did have current students, alumni, and those who have applied or have been already admitted. So I really like this diversity of the audience. I do hope that you found something, that sparked some interest for you or among you. If we had more time, I would actually, abuse this patience of Dr. Vatansever and ask him if he has any suggestions for students on topics perhaps to study in the oil sector or in the energy sector, not only to Russia, but pertaining to Russia and Eurasia in general. But I guess if you have any, if you have any either questions or suggestions like this, please do feel free to keep in touch with me or without me. Just write directly to our colleagues. Adnan, thank you very much again for accepting our invitation. I'm very much pleased to have this event, held today. And very last announcement is that we will have a similar session tomorrow at the same time at 6 p.m. St. Petersburg time. Our guest will be Dr. Mikhail Krutikhin, based in Moscow, Russia, and he will be talking whether there is a future to Russia's oil and gas sector. So everyone present here are kindly invited also to that event tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time and for your patience and for the great answers too.
Thank you very much, Georg. It's been really a pleasure, and I love your organization there. It's a top-notch institution, and I look forward to more opportunities for some collaboration.
Yeah. Same here. Thank you. Goodbye.